Kuki, Nitaniku Enkki. Hello, my name is Grant Manyheads. In Blackfoot, in the Blackfoot language, my name means singer. So that's what Enkki actually means when translated. So that's a little short introduction. And today we're going to be talking about Blackfoot history. Now in particular, we're going to be talking about firewater, alcohol, and its history with the Blackfoot people. So today, before we actually get started into that, we should explain to those viewers who are viewing in and those people who are just joining us who the Siksikaitsitapi actually are. So you see on that image in front there that it says Siksikaitsitapi, and that's how you actually pronounce that word. And loosely, I guess if you were to translate that into English, it would mean the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is not necessarily accurate, but it's as close as we can get to that particular word. The actual word Siksikaitsitapi means Blackfoot speaking peoples. So today there's actually 4 tribes that encompasses. And so one of them is Siksika, and that's actually where I come from, the Siksika people. And the Siksika are one tribe within the Siksikaitsitapi. And you'll notice that around this little circle there that there's Agena. And the other name for Agena is the Bloods. Then if you look on the other side there, it says Amskapi Pikani. And these are the Blackfoot speaking peoples who live in the United States of America today. And we call them Amskapi Pikani because that means they live across the line, the border. So the Pikani that live up in Canada, we usually call them Apatusi Pikani, meaning these ones that are living up near Pincher Creek and present-day Brockett. So these 4 tribes today make up the Siksikaitsitapi, the Blackfoot-speaking peoples. So if we move on to the next image, we look at our land. Now traditionally, this was our land. This was the Blackfoot-speaking people's homeland. So we called it Niitawasi. Now Niitawasi is our name for, as I mentioned, our land. So Niitawasin, that basically translates to the Blackfoot speaking peoples, that we are the people of the land of the buffalo. So our ancient stories, they tell us that we were given this territory by Itsipetapiopa, or the essence of life, the creator of the heavens and the earth. So we've believed that this land was given to us by the creator. And so if you look at Niitawasi, particularly at this next image, our territory extended from the Bonogasisita, or the North Saskatchewan River, which is where present-day Prince Albert and Edmonton, these cities kind of are on the North Saskatchewan River. So this was the northern boundary of the Blackfoot people's lands. Now they went all the way south down to the Yellowstone River, where you can see Billings and you can see Helena, and these countries in present-day Montana, United States of America. And then the western boundary was actually the backbone of the world, our Mistakis, the Rocky Mountains. And it extended about 300 miles or so to the Qu'Appelle Valley and Touchwood Hills, which is now present-day Saskatchewan. So this was a huge area, and this land was what the Blackfoot considered our land. And the reason why was because of the buffalo. So wherever the great northern herds of Ini, and that's our word for the modern day bison or buffalo, the Blackfoot called this animal Ini. And a herd of them we said Iniksi. So wherever these great northern herds roamed, our people followed them. And so you could say that our land was defined by Ini, by the buffalo. So if you look at that whole gray area on the previous map there, that was the lands that our people actually traveled. We traveled all throughout this vast land. And at that time, we had 2 allied tribes with us. So today, the one tribe was known as the Tsuut'ina people. In our language, we called them Sarsi, but they prefer to be called Tsuut'ina. And they were one of our allied tribes, and they lived to the northwest of us, along the backbone of the world. And then on the other side, on the northeastern side of us, were the Grovin, and like the Arapaho people. Now they lived up in the area of near Prince Albert. But because we are allied tribes, we all moved throughout our land freely. and with no problems, because we respected one another's hunting territory, our domains, the areas where we hunted, and there was free trade and there was intermarriage between the three tribes that made up the Blackfoot Confederacy, so to speak. So this was our lands. Just to let you know, the three tribes and the other, the Blackfoot people, the Tsutena and the Grovans. So if we look at the next image, well, in the dog days, or this was a day before we had horses, the Siksikaitsitapi, or the Blackfoot-speaking people, we were at first a people without horses. So we moved from place to place on foot. We were nomadic pedestrians, that's the word. And so from moving place to place on foot, at that time, the only beast of burden we had were dogs. And in our language, we called dogs imita, or imitakes. So the dog was our beast of burden in those days. And we got to know our lands intimately because we walked right throughout all that vast area that we just looked at in those previous maps. So if we look at the next image, Itotasimapi imitakes, the dog days. Well, in those days, the Siksikaitsitapi, we traveled only short distances at a time, maybe 4 or 5 miles a day. And we were satisfied as long as we were within sight of Iniksi, the great buffalo herds. Now, in those days, if we move to the next image, the buffalo, our Ini, was our staff of life. And basically what that means is Ini provided our people with food, clothing, and shelter. But it also had hundreds of other uses to the Siksikaitsitapi. So we were, from time immemorial, as far as our memory goes, thousands and thousands of years, we were buffalo hunters. Of all the plains tribes that exist on the plains in the buffalo days, we were a true buffalo people. We didn't have a certain place that we lived and then we left on the season to hunt the buffalo. We followed the buffalo year round. So wherever the buffalo went, Ini went, our people followed. So as I mentioned earlier, our land was defined by the buffalo. So that huge vast area was where we used to roam when we were hunting this animal. So we had winter camps. So in the winter, the Siksikaitsitapi moved to the foothills or along the banks of the sheltered river valleys that fell within Nitawasi, our land. So there was a lot of rivers from the North Saskatchewan all the way to the Yellowstone. Just to name a few, there was a Belly River, there was a Waterton River as they call it now, or the Old Man River, the Bow River, High River, Sheep River, the Elbow River, all the way up to the Red Deer River, all the way up to the North Saskatchewan River. All of these rivers, we would put our winter camps, because the buffalo, unlike other animals, it didn't migrate south when the weather got bad. What they did was they basically moved into the foothills, or they moved into the sheltered river valleys, as I mentioned, along all the different rivers that were within Nitawasi, our land. So for that reason, our people set up camp in these same places. And we knew that the buffalo, our Ini, would be coming to these rivers when the weather got bad, when the winter settled in, and we were already camped there, waiting for them to show up so we could hunt them. And we'd always, we'd have that supply of buffalo year round. Now, if we look at the next image, the way we lived, as I mentioned earlier, this is how the Blackfoot lived for literally thousands of years, for millennia. But then that changed. That routine changed around 1700. And we say circa 1700s because we really don't know. It could have been a few years before 1700, or it could have been a few years after 1700 when the Blackfoot people first obtained horses. So these horses, they actually came from Mexico when the Spanish invaded Mexico. We look at the next image, we can kind of see that, well, these horses, they were descendants of the animals brought by the Spanish when they invaded Mexico in the 1500s. So over the years, these horses were acquired by southern tribes, and gradually they migrated north, as you can see in the picture there. And as they were traded or stolen, and you can kind of see there in the middle there, up beside the mountains there, I can't really see, but at the very top, you see the arrow that goes into Canada from the United States region. Well, this is how long it took for the horses to reach into the Blackfoot area. And as I mentioned, that was around 1700. And by this time, when the Blackfoot actually acquired these horses, well, then we became an equestrian people. So before we even met the first European traders, when they first met us, we were already adapted to using the horse. So this was a big change for the Blackfoot people once we became equestrian tribes. If we look at the next image, well, hard on the heels of the new horse culture came the Notbequans, the Europeans with their wondrous goods. So these included what you could see in the picture here, metal objects such as knives, axes, and kettles. And these things made our daily life that much more easier. And together with beads and cloth for decoration and tobacco to replace our own kinnikinnick or our own bitter homegrown variety. So these items came to us at first through middlemen in trade. And if we look at the next image, you can see that there was a middleman trade, and these are the Cree and the Assiniboine. And so this kind of happened between the time period of 1680 up until 1786. So these European goods, they first came to us through the Cree and Assiniboine middlemen who got them from the traders on the shores of the Hudson Bay, and they brought them overland to the prairie tribes. Now, that's an interesting point, is that more often than not, the prairie tribes paid 3 times the cost for these goods. And they were usually secondhand goods. The middlemen, they rarely sold us new items. They would keep their items that they got from the Hudson Bay Company traders for 2 or 3 years. And once they were used, then they would trade these to the tribes further inland for huge amounts of furs. And then they would go back to the Hudson Bay and buy brand new goods. And so this kind of trade existed for almost 100 years. And during that time, our people hadn't met the Notbequans yet, but we were aware of them because we would have heard the stories from these people. So it would have been around the time of 1680 that our people would have known of the quote-unquote white men, or the Notbequans, and because of the goods coming into us. So it's important, just to know that our people, we didn't deal with the European traders right away, that we got these goods from other tribes, particularly the Cree and the Assiniboine, who were the middlemen in trade between that time period. So if we move to the next image, it's also interesting to note that the Hudson Bay Company trade from 1670 up until about 1770, so for about 100 years, or that first century, the Hudson Bay Company had no competition. So the Hudson Bay Company didn't deal at all in liquor. Liquor was no part of the European native trade at that time. In fact, the Hudson Bay Company imported just enough wine, brandy, and rum to serve the needs of its own officers and men on the shores of the Hudson Bay. So in 1770, for example, they only imported 250 gallons of liquor, and that was just for the use of the Hudson Bay Company and their employees. As I mentioned, during this time, when they had no competition, they never used liquor in trade. And that's kind of an interesting point. So if we move on to the next image, it wasn't until about 1786 or around that time period that the first European traders to deal directly with the Blackfoot tribes, or the Siksikaitsitapi, was at this Manchester House. It was a Hudson Bay Company post that was established in 1786 on the North Saskatchewan River. So this would have been a little bit more closer to the Blackfoot domains, and it was here that we started to actually trade with Europeans on a regular basis. So if we look at the next image, you can kind of see there on the top of the map there, especially on the northern border of the Blackfoot lands, all the different trading posts put up by the Hudson Bay Company. Now, the reason why that was our northern boundary is because that was the end of prairie land. If you look at it, the yellow part there, that's all plains, grass, prairie, and that's where the buffalo roamed. When you go north of the North Saskatchewan River, now you're going into aspen, woodland, parklands, and there's, not to say there's no buffalo, there were buffalo up north of the river there, But the majority of the buffalo were south of that boundary, were south of the North Saskatchewan River. So all the way down to the Yellowstone, as I mentioned, all the way out to the Qu'Appelle Valley and Touchwood Hills in Saskatchewan. This was all prairie. So this is where the buffalo roamed, and this is where the Blackfoot followed them. So this is what we considered Nitawasi, our land. And these traders were just on the northern fringes of the Blackfoot land, and they really had no effect on our day-to-day lives. And we preferred them to be that far out. But if you look at that particular map, you can see Manchester House, kind of from where I am. It's like 6 forts in from the Prince Albert region there. And this is where the Blackfoot first started to trade regularly with the European traders. And those traders were Hudson Bay Company traders and traders from the Northwest Company. Now, if we look at the next image, well, you see the fur trade. Well, when we met the first Napequans and we were trading with them on a regular basis in the late 1780s, these Napequans, their respective companies were already engaged in a bitter rivalry or a struggle for supremacy in the fur trade. Now, if we move on to the next image, we can see that the Hudson's Bay Company, which was established in England in 1670, they were competing with the Montreal-based Northwest Company. And these guys were competing to see which company would get the most beaver pelts. So you can see that cute little animal there, the beaver. Well, this beaver was almost wiped out all from the eastern parts of the country. And for that reason, they had to move inland. They had to move westward. Well, these companies were competing to see who could get the most beaver pelts. And other furs, small furs, small fur-bearing mammals like otters and such, mink. And these were for fashion-conscious Europe. Now, this was huge in Europe. So when you see this sign here, you could see that by the year, the 1600s, actually, can we enlarge that? Yeah. You can see that these hats, these were all made out of beaver. And so the need for more beaver fur exploded. It was huge in Europe. These beaver pelts were desired by Europeans for fashion, such as the hats, as you can see in the picture there. And the fur was valuable because it was waterproof and it was moldable and durable. And the best furs, like beaver, were very soft and smooth. But more importantly, these were symbols of social superiority. So if you notice in those time periods after the 1600s, when you saw the captain's hat or you saw any of these soldiers or even very wealthy European families or people, they would use the beaver hats kind of, that would let you know that these people had wealth, that they had money and power. So this was the importance of the beaver and fur trade in Europe. Now the Northwest Company in 1787, and David Thompson actually worked for both. He started off with the Hudson Bay Company, and then on his own he kind of went to the Northwest Company, but then he was enticed back to the Hudson Bay Company again. Well, it was when he was with the Northwest Company in 1787 that David Thompson spent the winter with the Piikani up near around present day the Red Deer, and even as far as pretty close to Calgary, just a few miles east of Calgary. Well, from this time, he established friendly trading relations with the Siksikaitsitapi. And so from that time, we had friendly trade relations with the European traders. Now, if we look at the next image, you can kind of see that, well, over the next few years, the fur traders moved farther and farther west. So if you look at that map, you can see this is the Hudson Bay Company, and they're coming from the Hudson Bay, making their way to the Manitoba region, present-day Manitoba region. And then from there, they made their way west on the North Saskatchewan. And following the North Saskatchewan west, they actually made their way to the Rocky Mountains. So as they moved farther west, they opened Fort Edmonton in 1794 and the Rocky Mountain House in 1799. And this is important because these are the two posts that were closest to the Blackfoot territory, or to Nitawasi. And these two posts is where the Blackfoot centered most of our trade after they were established. Now, this was the Hudson Bay Company route coming into the Blackfoot territory. If we look at the next image, you can see the Northwest Company trade route. And these people were coming from Montreal, so you could see them coming all the way east from Montreal, going up the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes region. And then from the Great Lakes region, they made their way to the Lake Winnipeg, as we call it now, and then basically followed the North Saskatchewan as well, going westward all the way to Mistakists, or the mountains, or the Rocky Mountains. And pretty much wherever the Hudson Bay Company set up a post, the Northwest Company set up a post nearby. And so they had this huge rivalry, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, when they were coming into the Blackfoot territory. So as I mentioned earlier, these people were already having a bitter rivalry by the time they reached the Blackfoot lands. So if we look at the next image, we see Fort Edmonton. So this is a drawing of the original Fort Edmonton post, and this was the Hudson Bay Company post, and that was established in 1794. So that's actually on the north side. You can see the fort there, and that's on the north side of the North Saskatchewan River, and that's where the present-day legislative buildings in Edmonton are situated. And right south of there would have been the beginning of Blackfoot lands, or Nitawas. So if we look at the next image, we actually come to the Rocky Mountain House. And this was actually established by the Northwest Company first, but then the Hudson Bay Company set up a post that was more permanent than the Northwest Company post. And that was established in 1799. And this post was actually the closest post to the Blackfoot lands, to Nitawas. So this is where the Blackfoot would regularly trade. And because it was closer to Blackfoot lands, we had less problems with the middlemen in trade, because by this time, the middlemen were no longer middlemen in trade, but they were rivals. So there was a lot of conflict that already started by this time between the Blackfoot tribes and the Cree and Assiniboine. So it was at this post that the Blackfoot would bring most of their trade, the Rocky Mountain House, in 1799. So it's important to note that, once the traders reached Nitawasin, or Nitawasi, our land, and established posts, well, now the Siksikaitsitapi were able to acquire a regular supply of guns, ammunition, and alcohol. And so this is when alcohol first starts to become a commodity that the Blackfoot people would purchase. And it was totally new to us. And so by this time, once these posts were established near Blackfoot lands, the middlemen trade was essentially eliminated. And so the middlemen in trade, as I mentioned, the Cree and the Assiniboine, now they were no longer part of that trade. We wouldn't trade with them anymore because we could trade with the European traders. And in fact, they end up becoming rivals in trade. And so this is when some of the conflict began. And so if you look at the top of the map, these were all the different posts that the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company set up along the North Saskatchewan River. So if we look at the next image, I'd like to point out, well, these fur trade posts, well, we benefited, the Siksikaitsitapi, they benefited from these trade goods because the forts were just beyond our hunting grounds. And so the traders had little effect on our people. Unlike with the Cree, the Stonies, or the Assiniboines, these people, the Europeans and those native tribes, they pretty much lived together and got to know each other and were part of each other's life. But because these trading posts were outside of our lands, basically, they never came into the Blackfoot lands. We would only meet with them at these trading posts. So that meant that the Siksikaitsitapi were able to retain control over our lands and maintain our independence. And we pretty much existed the same way we did before we met the Europeans, because they didn't have much of an influence on our people, except when we went to go to them to trade. So if we look at the next image, well, the Northwest Company. Well, when the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company first met head-to-head on the west, the Nor'westers, as they called them, the Northwest Company traders, they dominated the trade because they used alcohol or liquor. And as it's written there, through their excessive distribution of alcohol, both as gifts to entice the Indians to their forts and as items of trade. Well, at first, the Northwest Company used it to entice, as it said. They sold the liquor after, but at first it was given to the native peoples as gifts and as a way to open trade and part of the trade procedure. So this is how they got the native tribes to come over to the trading posts, because they would give them free gifts of alcohol, get them feeling good, and then let them go on a good drunk or a good binge. And then the next day they would say, okay, let's do the serious business of trade. And so this became part of the trading procedure. And the French, or the Northwest Company, they started this procedure with the tribes in the eastern part of Canada and the United States, long before they ever came up into the Hudson Bay region around the 1680s. So when they started competing with the Hudson Bay Company, they actually dominated the trade for a little bit there. Now, if we move on to the next image, who were the Northwest Company? Well, as I mentioned, these were Quebec traders, and the Nor'westers were descendants of the French voyageurs, and the other name for them was the Coureurs du Bois. And as you can see there in the picture, they're in the boats there, and then you can see the French hunter there with the rifle. Well, these people had been using liquor in their trade for generations, as I mentioned. So they were trading with the tribes down east, along the St. Lawrence, up along the upper and lower Canada. And so they had been trading with these tribes for generations before the Hudson Bay Company started to trade with the natives. Now, if we look at the next image, well, here we see the Hudson Bay Company trade on the Hudson Bay. Well, the HBC was convinced that to survive, it had to follow the Northwest Company's lead. So by 1785, it was bringing in more than 2,000 gallons a year to York Factory. So by the time of the Blackfoot trade, by the time it was established, its imports at the post were about 8,000 gallons annually. And it was supplemented by the liquor produced by their own still, still that was at the York Factory. So basically what that means is that, if you remember from a few slides back, before they started using liquor and trade, the Hudson Bay Company was only bringing in 250 gallons of alcohol, and that was just to serve the needs of its own officers and its own men, its employees. But then if you look at it, almost maybe not even 15 years later, now they're bringing 8,000 gallons of alcohol. And this was mostly for the Blackfoot trade. This was an amount of liquor that they were bringing in. And so they were importing a lot of their liquor, but they're also making their own at York Factory, just to supplement this trade with the Blackfoot tribes. Now, if we look at the next image, well, this whole region there, you see, this is considered Rupert's Land. This was the Hudson Bay. All the rivers that drained into the Hudson Bay. The King of England basically gave these traders this land. They said, this is English land. This is the British land. All these rivers that drain to the Hudson Bay, you have a right to trade with all the natives and the people that are in this area. So this is the extent of the Hudson's Bay Company's domain when they first started trading with the native tribes. And York Factory was their capital, basically where all their goods would end up funneling to, and then they would use their ships to take the furs to England. Now, if we look at the next image, okay, so high wines. This is what they called their liquor. So both companies, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they pretty much handled primarily rum and brandy, and they called it high wines. And these were brought in by water routes, like by ships. And when these ships came from England or Montreal, and they carried it in concentrated form in these huge wooden kegs. And so by these huge wooden kegs on ships, they would ship them to York Factory or to Montreal, depending on their destination. So at York Factory, that was Hudson Bay Company liquor. And if it came to Montreal, that's what the Northwest Company would use. They would ship in their liquor in these huge cases, these huge casks or kegs. Now, if we look at the next image, so at their destination, so basically when these high wines reached their destination, they were diluted with water. And for the Blackfoot, it was at the ratio of 7-to-1, meaning that they would put 7 parts water to 1 part of alcohol. And this is what they would sell to the native tribes. And actually not even sell. At first, they were giving these out as gifts, as I mentioned. And then they would sell some of it in limited quantities. So when the Blackfoot came to trade, they took away the liquor either in skin bags, like you can see there on the left, and then on the right, sometimes the companies would provide these smaller kegs, 1 or 5 gallon kegs that they can take back to their camps with them. And this is what they would use to entice the native tribes into trade. And this is how they enticed the Blackfoot speaking peoples into trading with them. So if we look at the next image, well, before we ever met the Europeans as Blackfoot people, Siksikaitsitapiks, alcohol had been unknown to our people. And virtually all North American tribes, alcohol was unknown to us. So in our language, the Blackfoot language, we called this alcohol or liquor napiuhki. And basically that translated to white man's water. And because it was thought to be water, our people wouldn't buy it from the traders at first because they figured, oh, wow, you can get water for free anywhere. Why should we pay for it? And they didn't see this white man's water as any different. So at first, the Blackfoot people did not pay for any of this. And the white traders, or the Hudson Bay Company traders, Northwest Company traders, they would give this alcohol to the Blackfoot speaking peoples as gifts. They would give them either in skin bags or in those kegs that we previously saw. They would give them to the Blackfoot people before trading as a gift. And usually that would get them feeling good and they'd want to come back and get a little bit more and such. But they didn't pay for it at first. So napi uhki, that was what the Blackfoot started to call liquor, or intoxicants. So if we move to the next image, well, alcoholism wasn't known to our people. So by the time that the trade began in the West, well, a lot of this was already taking place on the eastern seaboard. A lot of the tribes there were starting to be dominated by this whiskey or by this liquor. And it was deadly because a lot of those tribes suffered from exposure, or they die from drinking too much, weather would get bad, different reasons. But the Siksikaitsitapiks, we weren't immediately drawn to it. So even when they were giving it to us as gifts, the Blackfoot people didn't necessarily become victims of alcoholism and such, because we weren't addicted to it, or we didn't, how would you say, buy it in huge quantities. It was still, the only time we got it was when it was given to us as a gift. So we moved to the next image. This changed. So it wasn't long, but at first it's kind of interesting to note, like at Manchester House, the trade in 1787, Hudson Bay Company there, he commented, and I quote, he says that the Piikani are now the quietest nation in the country, except for the Blood Indians, and make no doubt will continue so till the Canadians or the Northwest Company get amongst them, for which the run of every is the ruin of every nation, by debauching their women and destroying themselves with poisonous rum. So at this time, the Hudson Bay Company were making that note. They noticed that the Blood tribes and the Piikani tribes that were trading with them, they weren't given to the whiskey, and they were actually still pretty much quiet when they came to trade, and they weren't really given to the whiskey. But they thought that once the French get amongst them and start giving them all this excessive alcohol, that things would change. And this Hudson Bay Company trader, he was right. But if you look at the next image, well, in 1789, a few years later, another trader by the name of Edward Umfreville, he stated that these people are not so far enervated by the use of spirituous liquor as to be taken to it, to be slaves to it. When they come to trade, they drink moderately and buy themselves necessaries for war and domestic conveniences. So even by this time, the Blackfoot people who were trading with the Hudson Bay Company traders, they weren't given to the alcohol. Like, it wasn't a problem for the Blackfoot people, that when they came to trade, usually they would buy themselves those items that were non-alcoholic, but were trade goods, like pots, pans, the things that we saw in those pictures earlier, tobacco, beads, cloth, that our people were still buying these things rather than gravitating towards whiskey or napiuhki. So we look at the next image, and here we have like gifts of alcohol. So as I mentioned, the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they knew that to gain and maintain the Blackfoot trade, they had to make the Siksikaitsitapi dependent upon alcohol and then supply it in greater quantities than their competition. And they knew this from dealing with the other tribes east of us. The different tribes on the eastern seaboard, this is how they managed to dominate those tribes, was by giving excessive gifts of alcohol to the point where these tribes, once they got used to drinking the alcohol, that now they were buying it. It wasn't given as gifts to them anymore. Now those tribes on the eastern seaboard had to buy it. And if they wanted the Blackfoot to start buying their goods and stuff, they had to get us hooked on it, basically. In other words, they had to get us dependent upon it. So as a result, these spirits were given as gifts by both companies until their goal was achieved. And it didn't take very long for that goal to become achieved. If we look at the next image, here at Fort George, which is kind of near the present-day Fort Edmonton, in 1794, a New York Northwest Company trader at Fort George basically described how successful they had been. And I quote, "The love of rum is our first inducement to industry," he wrote. "They undergo every hardship and fatigue to procure a skinful of the delicious beverage." He further described how alcohol had become an integral part of the trading process. So by this time, this is not even some 24 years after they started dealing with the Blackfoot tribes, so to speak, that now the Blackfoot tribes were just as much addicted to alcohol as the other tribes, the Cree and the Assiniboine. And so by this time, they weren't no longer the quiet tribes they had been. Now they were just as fully dependent on the alcohol when they came to trade. So if we look at the next image, here it says by 1811, actually can we enlarge that picture there a bit? By 1811, the trading procedure had become well established. So in that year, the trader, Alexander Henry, he commented that spirituous liquor now seems to dominate them. And this was the Bikani, and has taken such a hold upon them that they are no longer the quiet people they were. They appear fully as much addicted to liquor as the Crees. So in 1811, if we're looking at 1780 up until 1811, we're looking at not even 31 years. So within that time period, these trading companies, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, because of their excessive gift giving of liquor to the tribes, by this time, the tribes were addicted to liquor. When they came to the trading post, they fully expected to get napiuchki. They wanted to buy it. They wanted to have it. So this was one of the first things they would buy when they came to the trading posts. So around this time, the trading procedure was established. Now, on entering the house, as it points out there, the Blackfoot were disarmed because they didn't want to, they knew that if you had arms and you were drunk, you could be dangerous. So the Blackfoot were disarmed, and they kind of became a trading procedure where they would give them a little bit of whiskey and some tobacco, and then they would take out the pipe. And to the Blackfoot people, the pipe was an important way of meeting somebody. If you smoked the pipe with other people, other tribes, and basically you were saying to one another, okay, let's have good feelings between us, and let's smoke this pipe before the Creator so that we all kind of have like a good heart and good feelings towards in this meeting or while we're trading. So the traders understood this, and so they kind of took advantage of that. They're the ones who would start this trading procedure. They would get a pipe, and after it had been smoked, they usually the people would relax, the native tribes, and then the traders would give them rum, and then they would drink until pretty much they started to get drunk, inebriated, and then when they started to get noisy, they'd give them gifts. And so once their teepees or the lodges were set up outside of the trading posts, well, then the traders would give them maybe 5 gallons or so of liquor as a gift, and they would give it to each of the chiefs and to the different people. So the whole band would drink during that time period, maybe for a full day or even longer. And they would drink this gift liquor. And the Hudson Bay Company did it because they knew if they didn't do that for the Indians, the natives would go to the Northwest Company, and the Northwest Company would do the same thing. So got to remember there was a competition here. And so the Blackfoot Indians at this time, the Siksikaitsitapi, we thought, oh, these guys are being really nice to us. They're giving us free liquor. But there was a method behind that. These companies wanted the native tribes to get used to this liquor so that they could take advantage of us, especially during trade. So if we look at the next image, well, this trading procedure over the years had become established. So Alexander Henry kind of speaks about this. He would say how 2 messengers would arrive at the trading post to announce that the rest of the tribe was on its way. So these men they were each given tobacco and a glass of liquor. And when the main body of Indians arrived, then the chiefs were invited into the fort, where they went through that pipe smoking ritual. And then the distribution of free liquor. And then the chiefs and everybody would get gloriously drunk, as previously mentioned. So this was part of the trading procedure. And as I mentioned, the pipe smoking ritual, Alexander Henry, he goes on to say, after the first round, we give them each a half a gill of Indian liquor, which was the watered down liquor. You got to remember this. They take the high wines and it would be a 7-to-1 ratio, 7 parts water, 1 part of alcohol. And this is what they would give the native tribes, particularly the Blackfoot. And they would always begin this with the principal chief. And then he would get involved in this ritual. And as he dipped his finger into the liquor and let a few drops fall to the ground, then he would offer a few drops to the above people, but he would drink the rest without further delay. So this became a part of the trading procedure, was a pipe smoking ritual. And as I mentioned, this was something that traders fully took advantage of, because there were pipe smoking rituals before we met up with the Europeans, and it was always a sacred sort of a gathering or a sacred event between the native tribes. But traders took advantage of this, and they introduced the tobacco and drinking alcohol during the same time as this pipe smoking. So if we go to the next image, well, then we find out that after the smoking and drinking for about half an hour, well, then each chief was given a quart of liquor to take back to his camp. And others who wanted liquor, they often went to the fort to trade meat, tongues, and as the trader says, other trash, but they would give them liquor so that they could drink all day and into the evening. And so the natives would leave the forts and come back to their own camps. And then the camps, everybody within the camp would pretty much get drunk, inebriated. And this was the trading procedure. So the next morning, when pretty much everybody was sober, well, then began the serious trade. And as you can see here, they wouldn't allow the natives into the forts or into the posts, but they would have like windows outside of the fort. And then this is where the people would actually trade their hides and trade their buffalo or their beaver pelts for the Europeans' trade goods. And so they continued to buy liquor, but for the most part, they traded their furs and robes and dried meat and horses for European goods like metal objects, axes, utensils, cloth, and whatever that the traders had to offer. So this became routine. So you have to understand, this didn't happen like over a 5-year period. This was like for 100 years. The Blackfoot became used to this type of trade. Every year they would go into the trading posts. They would travel whatever distance to get to the trading post on the North Saskatchewan River, and they would trade either with the Northwest Company traders or with the Hudson Bay Company traders. And whatever post they went to, as you can see in the picture here, usually they would get a good drunk going on for days. So it'd be like it would almost be like an event, a fair that these people would go to once or twice a year, and they would stay at these forts for maybe 2 or 3 days until they finished drinking and trading, and then they would leave these trading posts and go back to life. They would go back to regular life. They would go back to hunting the buffalo, following the herds, and doing what we did for millennia. But as I mentioned, maybe once or twice a year, then they would bring their pelts to these trading posts to trade for European goods. Because by this time, over 100 years, we became used to these items, and these items made our life so much easier, especially like things as axes and metal knives and awls and sewing needles and cloth. Now we can make clothes, we could bead them, we could do different things because we had the tools, iron or steel tools to work with, which made life a whole lot easier. Now, in 1803, something happened in the southern parts of Nitawas. And this was the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803, American President Thomas Jefferson, he purchased the Louisiana Territory, as you see there in the green, from Napoleon for $15 million. So the United States before this time actually only existed on the eastern part of the Mississippi River. But after 1803, after this $15 million exchange, well then now this brought under American control lands between the Mississippi River and Muskogee, the Rocky Mountains. And these lands would eventually become 13 new states in the Union, or the American states. So, but during all this time, you know, the Siksikaitsitapi, we were unaware that the lands that we had occupied for countless generations, they were now bought and sold by distant self-appointed masters. So we had no idea who Napoleon was or who Thomas Jefferson was, but these people between themselves sold our lands. And so now this gave the Americans a reason to come into the Blackfoot lands and follow the rivers right up to the mountains. And now they considered these lands theirs. Now, if we go to the next image, Lewis and Clark. So in 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition, returning from the Pacific through Blackfoot country, through Nitawasin, they encountered a party of Blackfoot warriors. So this ended up in an altercation which resulted in the death of 2 Blackfoot warriors. And after this, as written there, the unfortunate run-in with Captain Lewis and his men of the Lewis and Clark expedition, this hardened the hearts of the Siksikaitsitapi towards Americans. And this actually helped identify these blue-eyed invaders from the east as new enemies to the Siksikaitsitapi. So these Napik ones, coming from the southern parts and eastern parts, the Blackfoot people saw them as enemies because of the Lewis and Clark expedition. At that time, if you look at the history books, they say that these natives, 2 Blackfoot natives, were trying to steal the horses from Lewis and Clark. But according to the Blackfoot people, there was a bet that was a wager that was made the previous evening, and Napik ones lost that bet. And they were to take, they won 2 horses from them. So they were to take these horses, and as they were doing it, somebody else, not knowing of this wager, opened fire on the Blackfoot, thinking they were stealing horses. So the Blackfoot at this time weren't trying to rob these people. They actually spent a peaceful night with them. It wasn't until the early morning that this happened. And then, according to American history books, the Blackfoot were in the wrong. But according to the Blackfoot history, the Lewis and Clark expedition were in the wrong. And for this reason, the Blackfoot hated any Americans coming from the eastern parts of and the southern parts of Nitawasin, our land. So we look at the next image. It's kind of true here. Here you can see a picture of a man hiding behind a piece of wood in the river and some natives looking for him on the shore. Well, this was a man named John Colton. We'll get to that in a moment. But, you know, as I mentioned, the Siksikaitsitapi, we soon learned to distinguish between their old friends, who were the northern white men, and those are the Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company traders, and their new enemies, who we called the Big Knives. So there was American fear of encountering Blackfoot tribes, and this fear of encountering these Blackfoot tribes had grown steadily ever since word spread throughout the territory that hostile Indians, the Blackfoot, had stripped a mountain man named John Colter. They stripped him naked and they forced him to run for his life. So people call this Colter's Run. And this man was a mountain man and a trader, and the Blackfoot looked at him as a thief, because basically they were coming into Blackfoot lands and hunting fur-bearing mammals without permission, and not even asking the Blackfoot permission to go into Blackfoot lands or into Nitawasin. So anytime that these traders or mountain men would come into the Blackfoot lands, more often than not, these traders were driven out or killed. So like soon after this particular event, the Blackfoot killed 8 traders of Andrew Henry's party, because he was trying to build a fort or a stockade near the 3 forks of the Missouri, which fell within Nitawasin, the Blackfoot territory. So when they tried to put up this stockade, this party was attacked and 8 of these traders were killed. So every year after, there would be American traders who would enter Blackfoot territory, never to be seen again. So for the longest time, the Americans were very cautious when they went up the Missouri River into Blackfoot country, because the Blackfoot people, as I mentioned, truly hated these invaders from the east. So the Siksikaitsitapi, they maintained friendly relations with the British and Canadian traders. In sharp contrast was the hostility that they maintained towards American explorers and traders. But something happened in 1821. The liquor traffic, it continued in the British territory until 1821. And that's when the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, they merged into the Hudson Bay Company. So now there was just the Hudson Bay Company operating in the British territories, and there was no competition. So for that time, the Hudson Bay Company kind of didn't use alcohol so much because now they had no more competition, but that was soon to change. Because if we look at the next image here, in 1831, well, not until 1831, did the Americans finally establish trade relations with the Siksikaitsitapi. Now, this was largely because of a man named Alexander Mackenzie, who married a Blackfoot woman, and because of another man named Jacob Berger. Because up until this time, as I mentioned earlier, any Americans going up the Missouri into Blackfoot country are usually murdered and killed by the Blackfoot. But this Jacob Berger was a former Northwest Company trader, and he worked with the Hudson Bay Company as well, and he spoke Blackfoot. So he led a small party up into the Blackfoot territory, and he gained the trust, and he camped with the Piikani on the Missouri for the winter. And then that spring, he came out to this Fort Union with a Blackfoot trading party. And then the American Fur Company established trade relations with the Blackfoot. So at this time, the American Fur Company, they built Fort Union, as you can see in this image here, on the upper Missouri. And the American Fur Company did not hesitate to traffic in whiskey, the same as with the Hudson Bay Company. So we move to the next image. From 1670, you can see, to 1831. From the beginning, the liquor trade was a profitable business. So major companies like the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, and later the American Fur Company, they used their competition with one another to justify their use of liquor in the trade with the Blackfoot people. There was efforts during this time not to try and ban the use of liquor when trading with the native peoples, but it really didn't work, because when the British wanted to ban it, they had used the excuse that the Americans were using liquor, so that they had to continue selling liquor or using liquor in the trade to maintain that competition. This is the same thing that the Northwest Company did with the Hudson Bay Company until they merged. And then when they merged, this is what they do in competition with the American Fur Company. So after they built Fort Union, they came upstream and they built another fort that was burnt down. And then eventually they built Fort Mackenzie. And this was on the Missouri River as well. Well, during this time, for decades, because of the decades of excessive distribution of liquor by the fur traders, this liquor created havoc among the tribes, because people would end up quarreling. They would fight amongst each other. There are serious feuds and disputes that erupted from this. And also between tribes, there was a lot of problems because of these drinking bouts. Now, as you can see the picture here, this was an engraving done by Carl Bodmer when he visited Fort Mackenzie with one German prince by the name of, I can't remember his name right offhand, Maximilian Duide. Well, when they came to Fort Mackenzie, they actually lived there, and what they witnessed was a battle between the Assiniboine and Cree, who were attacking the Blackfoot, who were camped just outside of Fort Mackenzie. And the reason they attacked them was because they knew that the Blackfoot went there to trade. They saw them laden with their pelts and their furs and all the stuff that they were bringing in to trade with the traders here. But because of that trading procedure, as I mentioned, that the traders did with the different tribes, well, when the Blackfoot got there, they got drunk for the first night, and so they got gloriously drunk. And then by early morning, when all the Blackfoot were seriously inebriated and drunk or passed out, that's when these Cree and Assiniboine warriors attacked this small camp of Blackfoot. And they would have been wiped out if it wasn't for the fact that there were hundreds of other Blackfoot camps just upriver on the Missouri River. So they managed to get some scouts to get out there and alert the other Blackfoot tribes. And then the Blackfoot tribes moved in there and saved that remnant of Blackfoot who were camped outside of Fort Mackenzie, and they managed to drive the Cree and Assiniboine back and drive them away. But because so many people were drunk, there was actually over 300 Blackfoot who died in this particular encounter. And this was all because of alcohol, because of the drinking and because of the trading procedure where people were drinking. So the thing is, these sort of events happened, but also even when other tribes weren't attacking the Blackfoot, even amongst the Blackfoot, they would fight one another or things would happen. Just like today when you have parties and people are drinking, etc., people might get into fights or etc. because of the excess use of alcohol. Well, these things were happening even then, 1832. I think this event actually happened at Fort Mackenzie. So Fort Mackenzie was actually a fort that the American Fur Company built a little further upriver from Fort Union. And this was where a lot of the Blackfoot went to start trading with the American Fur Company rather than going to Fort Union, which was closer to enemy tribes. So just like as around the British forts, the use of liquor resulted in debauches and tragedies, the same around American forts. So while periodic drinking in the Siksikaitsitapi's home camps resulted in violence and bloodshed, still it was not a major disruption of normal daily life. And the reason we say that is because the Blackfoot tribes during this time, when they visited the British forts or the American forts, they usually didn't stay there any longer than 2 or 3 days. They would go there to trade their furs for European goods, but always after that period of time, they would go back to their regular life, following the buffalo and hunting the buffalo. And as I mentioned, the buffalo was our staff of life, and we were still following the herds. It was only maybe once or twice a year that the Blackfoot would actually go to the forts to do their trading. So the Blackfoot's normal daily routine was usually not disrupted by alcohol. It would only happen maybe once or twice a year, as I mentioned, because once the whiskey was gone, it would be months before the Siksikaitsitapiks would have another taste of Napiokki. So as you can see in this particular map around that time, well, you can see the British and the British forts up in the North Saskatchewan, way up in the northern parts of our territory, but way on the southern parts of the Blackfoot territory, you saw Fort Union, kind of at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. And then you could see Fort Mackenzie, kind of closer to the mountains there on the Missouri River. And then after this, if we look at the next map, next image, you can see the American Fur Company's trade route. So they started from St. Louis. St. Louis was actually the capital of the fur trade for the Americans. And the thing is, what they had was steamboats that actually traveled up the Missouri River as far as Fort Vermilion. And then if you see the different forts, Fort Lookout, Fort Pierre, and these were like in modern day South Dakota, if you look at it. And then they went farther north to Fort Berthold and Fort Clark. And then you see Fort Buford and Fort Union. Well, these forts were set up for the fur trade, the American fur trade. And Fort Union was the first fort that acquired the Blackfoot trade. And as you can see, then there's Fort Mackenzie. And then there was Fort Benton. And Fort Benton was actually became one of the last American Fur Company trading posts. But this is where the Blackfoot traded with the American Fur Company because it was the closest fort to the Nitawasin, to the Blackfoot lands. So although whiskey was sold by the American Fur Company, it was not its main stock in trade. So like the Hudson Bay Company, the American Fur Company gave liquor as gifts to bring in their customers, and they sold limited quantities of liquor. But the fact was the Americans offered more trade items at cheaper prices than the British. So that enticed the Blackfoot tribes, and more Blackfoot tribes would go to the American traders to trade at Fort Benton. So here's the Fort Benton on the Missouri. It was the American Fur Company trading post. It actually had its first start in 1846, but by 1850 it was already established as American Fur Company post. And by this time the Blackfoot were trading here regularly. Well, we wouldn't go to the other places. Fort Mackenzie was actually burnt down by this time, and Fort Union was too far for us to want to travel, especially when Fort Benton was here. And so this became a very important place because this is where the people would start to store their liquor. And the funny thing is, Fort Benton was actually on Blackfoot land. And so according to American law, they shouldn't have even been selling liquor to the Blackfoot tribes. But they were actually situated on Blackfoot land at that time. And also in 1862, the first steamboat arrived at Fort Benton. So that made Fort Benton the farthest inland post in the world. So it was actually 3,485 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, and the steamboats were able to make that distance from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to Mississippi and then the Missouri River, all the way up to Fort Benton. And these steamboats were able to carry more trade goods, and they were able to take more furs downriver back to St. Louis. And this gave the American Fur Company a greater advantage than the Hudson Bay Company, because at that time the Hudson Bay Company still were using canoes. So even though they had the waterway like the North Saskatchewan River all the way to the Pacific and all the way to Hudson's Bay Company, the Hudson Bay Company had to use paddle boats, canoes. Maybe they could move 1,000 pounds on one canoe, but that's all they could take. They were limited in the amount of goods they could bring upriver and the amount of furs that they could bring downriver. Whereas the Americans were able to take more upriver and more downriver through the use of these steamboats. So, as I mentioned, this was Fort Benton was situated on Blackfoot land. So when the Hudson Bay Company and the AFC had this rivalry, this new competition, the Hudson Bay Company felt it had no alternative but to continue to supply liquor to the Blackfoot tribes. They actually cut down the supply of liquor to a lot of tribes further east, but not the Blackfoot. They wanted the Blackfoot trade because of the amount of furs that were coming in. So although they used the liquor primarily as gifts to keep the trade relations with the Blackfoot, they wouldn't relinquish, or they wouldn't lessen the amount of alcohol that they brought to the Blackfoot tribes. And because the AFC was made up of former Hudson Bay Company and Northwest Company traders, they adopted the British trade system to compete with the Hudson Bay Company. So as I mentioned, they brought in more goods, and there was more and more people that were coming to the Americans to trade. So if we look at the effects of the liquor trade on the Siksikaitsitapi, well, the honest truth, it was pretty disastrous. Because as I mentioned at first, well, actually, as I wrote there, the disastrous effects of the liquor on the Blackfoot while they were at the trading posts immediately upon their return to camps cannot be questioned. I mean, there were a lot of bad things that happened once the liquor became part of the Blackfoot trade. So during the decades of this excessive distribution by the fur traders, liquor created havoc among the tribes because people killed each other in quarrels and they had serious feuds or disputes. Just like today, like sometimes when there's an excess of alcohol, some people will lose control and they'll do things that they don't remember, black out, maybe kill one another. And this was happening to the Blackfoot people at that time. And the only reason it wasn't more serious was because the Blackfoot usually came to trade maybe once or twice a year. And so these effects, these disputes and this killing and murders and such were happening only when the Blackfoot went to these trading posts to trade. And usually because of the excessive alcohol and the drinking, the binge drinking, then bad things would happen then. But after they left the trading posts, then this wouldn't continue. People got back to their normal lives and it didn't become such an issue. So if we look at the next image. Oh, okay. So I'm just going to mention that we're going to continue on with this liquor trade. This is up until 1850 or so. I want to kind of make that point. This sort of life, this sort of drinking, this routine was how it was up until about 1850. And then after 1850, things got worse. And that's going to be next week's program. We'll talk about how things got worse for the Blackfoot people up until the time of the Northwest Mounted Police's arrival. And also from there up until our day. We'll talk a little bit about the effects of the liquor trade on the Siksikaitsitapi. So until then, I'll see you next week. Remember, COVID's still out there. Be safe. Take care of yourselves. And Gaita Mutson.